On the 13th of February 1945, one of the more infamous Allied raids was launched against the city of Dresden in East Germany. The city was a cultural hub and was dubbed the Florence of Elbe. However, during World War II, it would be hit with around 4,000 tons of incendiary weapons and high explosive bombs. The city was subjected to a devastating firestorm, and an estimated 25,000 people lost their lives. In today's video, we will cover the events of the bombing raids on Dresden, the justification for the attack, and the controversy since. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation as to the European theatre at the start of 1945. The failed German offensive of the Battle of the Bulge had delayed the Allied push by only a matter of weeks, and the Soviets in the east were pushing onward to Berlin. The German Air Force was all but spent, spread thin and whittled down by the constant bombing raids throughout Germany, and yet the war was by no means over. The British and American bombing runs had targeted the industrial heartlands of Germany. The goal was to destroy or delay Germany's wartime industries, especially those vital for the Nazi war machine. In Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah sought to destroy the German shipyards, oil refineries, and the homes of the workers for these industries. The attacks in 1943 killed an estimated 40,000 people. There was little in the way of precision bombing, meaning targeting a single arms factory or shipyard proved difficult. Incendiary bombs were used to create firestorms that engulfed the city, destroying much of the civilian housing and causing hundreds of thousands to flee as refugees. But unlike Hamburg, Dresden was not easily reachable by Western Allied bombers. Far in the east, it would take the bombers around 4 hours each way. Not to mention, they would have to fly over potentially well-defended cities and would have to deal with the German Air Force fighters intercepting. Reaching Dresden early in the war would have been a difficult endeavour. For these reasons, Dresden was not a major target for the Western Allies. Stalin, however, was eager for bomber support in the east. By targeting Dresden, the Allies also hoped to reduce the capability of German communication and troop movement, whilst also creating chaos with refugees and the destruction of key infrastructure. This latter point was a lesson learned following the German bombing of major European cities, and something that Churchill was keen to inflict on Germany. The bombing of Britain, known as the Blitz, saw bomber attacks on consecutive nights, seeking to destroy British industry and destroy morale to continue the war. The city of Dresden was also a major railway hub, moving troops and supplies to the east. It was the largest German city still untouched by major Allied bombing, with over 120 arms factories, glass for gun and plane sights, aircraft engines, and anti-aircraft guns were all produced in Dresden. And following the Soviet attacks, 300,000 German refugees were forced to live in Dresden, with the city becoming their temporary home. The city of Dresden was designated as a key defensive zone, but it was not expected to be bombed. The Nazis believed it would be more likely besieged, akin to Stalingrad, with intense fighting in the streets. It was therefore likely expected that Dresden would be razed, but not by aerial bombardment. If not destroyed in a siege, it was feared that the cities such as Dresden could become staging grounds for further German offensives. Like so many other cities, the anti-aircraft guns had slowly been removed and deployed at locations deemed more vital. However, in a more darker turn, it is hard to ignore the retributive element in the decision to target a civilian population centre for bombing raids. Britain and much of Europe had been subjected to area bombing by the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. Over 43,000 people were killed during the Blitz, around 17,000 people killed during the bombing of Belgrade, and an estimated 20,000 killed in the bombing of Warsaw. The Allied forces wanted retribution. There is a quote by Arthur Bomber Harris, head of the British Bomber Command, which highlights this attitude quite plainly. The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and nobody was going to bomb them back. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half a hundred other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. On the 13th of February 1945, around 800 Lancaster bombers made their way to Dresden. They were loaded with a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs. They were met with only a few dozen German fighters, and the German fighters were outmatched. They were incapable of stopping the bombers from reaching Dresden. As this was a nighttime raid, marker flares were first dropped over Dresden to help guide the bombers to the centre of Dresden. The first wave of bombers numbered 240, dropping their payload at 10:13 p.m. The first wave took 15 minutes to drop their mixed payloads. The explosive bombs destroyed buildings, whilst the incendiary bombs exploited the damage to start numerous fires all over the city. Around 800 tons of bombs were dropped in the first wave alone. The second wave of 500 bombers was to strike when Dresden's emergency response and firefighters were trying to control the situation and began bombing some 3 hours after the first wave. The inferno below was visible from miles away, painting a target for their incoming bombers. This also meant that the second waves targeted the suburbs and the areas outside of the centre. A further 1,800 tons dropped over the next few hours. More incendiary bombs were dropped into the firestorm that was beginning to form. The firestorm was caused when the fire was large enough that it sustained its own wind system. It drew more and more oxygen from the surrounding areas, increasing the heat. The thousands of fires heated the air, causing updrafts that took ever more oxygen. Survivors of the bombing recalled how it felt like stepping into an oven due to the intense heat. Some witnessed people being thrown up into the air, consumed by the firestorm. Due to the heat, the tar in the street began to bubble, turning into liquid and making escape for those without decent footwear impossible. As the oxygen was robbed by the fires, those with troubled breathing, the old and the unfit began to collapse. Carbon monoxide was produced in great quantities, poisoning those who sought shelter, unaware of the danger. It is understood that the carbon monoxide produced was the biggest killer of the Dresden raid. Many of those who died did so in the open. For the residents of Dresden, air raids were an unknown, as it never happened before, nor was it expected to happen. Many did not have access to proper air raid shelters, instead hiding in basements. Whether through incompetence or through a misguided belief that the city was never going to be bombed, Dresden was lacking in proper air raid shelters. Most were built by the residents and not by the authorities. One of the largest shelters was a basement under the main railway station, which held 6,000 people. Unfortunately, these basements would often become death traps for those within. Many of the residents were unaware of the dangers. Some believed that after the first wave, the danger had passed. Some of the fires were dealt with, and after the all clear was given after the first wave, many of the exhausted residents simply returned to bed. One person who witnessed the firestorm and its terrible effects attempted to shelter in a basement with his wife, twin children, and mother, and he recalled the horrors as follows. "We saw terrible things, cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burned to death. Burning people ran to and fro, burned coaches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers and soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families. There was fire everywhere. And all the time, the hot wind of the firestorm threw people back into the burning houses that they were trying to escape from. For those in the basements, many found the buildings above engulfed in flames, with the basements filling with smoke or even collapsing. Many of those who survived made their way to the river Elbe, hoping that the water would offer some form of protection, but not everyone could escape, as seen by one survivor named Margaret Freyer, who said, quote, "To my left, I suddenly see a woman. I can see her to this day, and I shall never forget it. She carries a bundle in her arms. it is a baby. She runs, she falls, and the child flies into an arc into the fire. Suddenly, I saw people again right in front of me. They scream and gesticulate with their hands, and then, to my utter horror and amazement, I see how one after the other they simply let themselves drop to the ground. Today, I know that these unfortunate people were victims of a lack of oxygen. They fainted and then burned to cinders. Yet there would be more carnage, this time brought by the American bombers. The target was the railway marshalling yards. Over 300 B-17 bombers dropped another 800 tons of bombs. Smoke from the night's fires and heavy clouds made visibility poor. Around 60 bombers missed their mark and ended up accidentally attacking Prague instead. In the end, an estimated 25,000 men, women and children were killed in the Dresden air raid, and around 350,000 people were left homeless, with half of the residential buildings destroyed or severely damaged. A quarter of the industrial buildings were destroyed, yet there are questions as to how long such industry was impacted. Albert Speer, the Nazi Minister of Armaments and War Production, would later insist production was halted for only a few weeks. Much of Dresden was destroyed, to the extent that dynamite and bulldozers had to clear out the old for reconstruction in post-war Germany. Shortly after the bombing, the Allied forces faced criticism for their decision to target Dresden. In one press briefing, Air Commodore Colin Grierson was quoted as stating that whilst the primary reason for targeting Dresden was the disruption of communication and movement of troops, he added that the effect on German morale was a factor too. Newspapers, even with the influence of wartime censorship, began to run stories that the Allies had resorted to the very terror bombing inflicted by the Nazis. After Dresden, the appetite for the bombing of German cities faded, and yet it should be noted that from February to March 1945, the Allies in Western Europe suffered almost 100,000 casualties, with the Soviets in the East losing even more. Aside from looking to end the war and retribution for German attacks throughout Europe, another motivation is suspected for the bombing of Dresden. Western allies were under no delusion that the Soviet Union would be a wartime ally, but they would be a post-war adversary. It is believed that the bombing of Dresden was to serve as a warning as to the Western air power and to demonstrate to the Soviets the danger in aggression against them. One of the more controversial issues relates to the number of refugees in Dresden at the time of the bombing. Western allies were very well aware that hundreds of thousands of refugees were seeking shelter. This in fact did play a part in the justification for the bombing of Dresden. It was hoped that the extra stress on German infrastructure in dealing with even more refugees would bring an end to the war much sooner. There has been for decades a great debate as to the numbers killed by the Dresden bombing raid. One of the earliest sources on the death toll comes from an SS report. As the Nazis were uncovering and counting the dead, they made detailed records of who had died and where. Bodies needed to be collected quickly as to avoid outbreaks of disease. Many of the corpses were burned in furnaces and were directed by SS officers from the Treblinka death camps, as they were well versed in the disposal of Holocaust victims. They confirmed over 18,000 dead, with another estimated 7,000 still to be recovered. Reports detailing the dead at 20,240 were amended by Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels. He added another zero onto the death toll, trying to claim that over 200,000 people were killed in the attack. Goebbels sought to paint Dresden as an attempt by the Allies to destroy German culture and people. Since the end of World War II, some historians have sought to equate the bombing of Dresden with the bombing of Hiroshima. One notable revisionist once claimed that as many as 135,000 people were killed in Dresden. The inflated figure is still touted, often by those who seek to equate the war crimes of the Allies with the crimes against humanity committed by the Nazis, although the prominent revisionist who made this claim has since come forward and stated that his claims were false. Nevertheless, by today's standards, the bombing of Dresden would likely be considered a war crime. In a time of total war, the bombing of civilian centres was carried out by all sides of the war. That does not justify the attacks, but rather points out how such bombings were seen as just part of the war. The bombing of Dresden should serve as a disturbing reminder as to the effects of civilian bombing. Whilst there are clear military benefits to destroying civilian populations supporting a war effort, such attacks are now rightly prohibited.